Kyle Lowry gets in the paint, keeps that dribble alive, searching. Butler tries again. Butler won't go, but a foul. I believe Michael Malone's going to challenge it.
And I think David Guthrie actually encouraged him to challenge it.
Remember this call? In Game 5 of the NBA Finals, the biggest game of the season with everything on the line. This was called a foul. And that's not the worst part about it. After reviewing it, the officials looked at each other and said, "That's a good call." Now Miami went on to lose anyway, so no one really cared. But looking back at it, this call showed us everything we need to know about the NBA's reffing right now. From terribly called games all regular season.
This is exactly why replay was instituted.
To the league's MVP, being the most notorious flop artist in the sport. He's constantly rewarded for playing like this, by the way, leading the league in free throw rate last season. And this type of flopping has become the new normal all around the league. I've decided that it's time to take a deeper look at these issues. Who caused them? Who they affect the most? And how do we fix them?
"17 seconds from Game 7 or from championship number 6. Jordan, open.
NBA officiating is at its best when the level of contact allowed by the offense and the defense are similar. I feel like most of the NBA's die-hard fans would agree with this statement. And for most of the NBA's history, the NBA and its officials have tried their best to keep this balance between offense and defense. Thinking Basketball did a great video on this, showing us the evolution of the game from the 1970s, where this was an offensive foul, to the 2000s, where this was a clean play all around. But the thing about this rising physicality is that it was evident on both sides of the ball. Offensive players were allowed to initiate some more contact, but defensive players were also allowed to use their hands a lot more as well. The NBA during the 70s, 80s and 90s seemed to straddle this line well. It was in the early 2000s where this physicality had seemed to have gone too far and started to favor the defense. Even though offensive players were allowed to initiate more contact than ever, defensive players being allowed to bump and hold offensive players was still giving the defense an edge. Though there were some players who were just strong enough to power through it. Most of the league buckled under this defensive physicality, and both the league's scoring and offensive rating reflected that. With some of the lowest margins the league had seen in 20 years. So what did the league do? In an effort to keep the game equal, the league implemented some new defensive restrictions. And though for a while it seemed to work like a charm, those same rule changes laid the groundwork for the terrible officiating we have today. These rule changes basically said, no hand checking, less grabbing and holding at a screener, and no body checking of an offensive player coming around the screen. Now it wasn't just about these actual rule changes, It was about the message being sent to officials. Defenders shouldn't be allowed to get away with as much physical contact as before. And like I said, it worked like a charm. Offensive rating immediately jumped over 3 points and continued to rise until reaching the league's sweet point of between 107 and 108, which is where the league's offensive rating had been for most of its existence. And even though it seemed the league had pulled back on defensive physicality, the elimination of the illegal defense rule and implementation of the defensive 3-second rule, allowing for more shading and more defensive tactics, seemed to give the defense enough help to keep the sport balanced. So even though scoring continued to rise, offensive rating showed that it was more likely due to pace than to an imbalance in the game. That doesn't mean, however, that there weren't clear signs of where the league was headed. The rip-through was the first sign that the offense could purposely initiate contact, only to get to the free throw line and get rewarded for it. It isn't to take a dribble, it isn't to pass, it isn't to shoot. The only use of the rip-through is to draw a foul. Kobe used it, and then Durant followed suit. He even won a couple scoring titles doing this. Now the league should have outlawed it then, but instead, they chose to just change it from a shooting foul to a common foul, which means you could still use it on a team that's over the limit to get to the free throw line. The league showing that they would allow blatant foul baiting like this would probably turn out to be their biggest mistake, as they had no idea who was watching and what was coming. While different teams and players started taking advantage of this new offense-first reffing in different ways, like more blatant illegal screening, more foul baiting techniques, and more aggressive drives and push-offs, there was a monster being created in Houston. A player who'd push these new rules and foul baiting tactics to a whole new level. Some call him basketball's Hitler, James Harden. Harden saw a player like LeBron being allowed to use his shoulder to discard defenders. But he didn't just lower his shoulder. He added his patented bent elbow push-off. Harden also took the rip-through to another level, adding his signature offhand hook. He took advantage of looser and looser traveling rules by adding a sort of double step back to his game. He then took advantage of the league's new focus on landing space fouls, made worse by Zaza Pachulia's dirty foul on Kawhi Leonard in the 2017 NBA playoffs. Harden would step back and proceed to launch his legs into defenders who didn't make any contact with him when it was clearly not the way he normally landed. Defenses had no answers for these tactics. He was also a master of the head snap. Harden could shoot the ball horribly and still have a good scoring game simply because he was getting to that line no matter what. The league and referees did nothing about this, and Harden proceeded to rack up some scoring titles and MVPs playing this style. He even pushed the greatest team of all time to their absolute limit. So even though he never won the big one, Harden was wildly successful playing like this. And the NBA being the copycat league they are, everyone followed. Yes, Harden has his clear disciples who you can tell copied his bag of tricks to a T.
And I've watched James Harden, like I said, Trey, to masters at that, and kind of try to, put it into my game.
But you turn on any regular season game, within 5 minutes of watching, you'll see some one of Harden's tactics being used. If not the head snap, the flailing, the hooking, the launching your legs into defenders. It's common all over the league in every team's game. And though Harden was a pioneer, I'm not gonna blame him for these foul baiting tactics being so common, because the league was probably headed in this direction anyway. Great scorers were always going to try and take advantage of the NBA's friendly and friendlier offensive whistle. One could argue the Golden State Warriors had the same effect with illegal screening, even though that's been a problem for a long time. And they were continuing to get more and more blatant. Golden State, and specifically Andrew Bogut, seemed to push these rules further and further, sometimes blatantly pushing players while they were screening. And don't forget, the NBA had removed some of the counters for illegal screening, like bumping a player coming around the screen and holding screeners. Even though some Warriors playoff opponents did get away with using these methods. Overall, referees are quick to call these fouls. This is just another example of the offense getting more and more leeway, and the defense gets more and more restricted. And even though flopping is probably more annoying to watch, in a league where the pick and roll is the most common play, screeners getting to constantly push and hold players is probably as damaging as the flopping in itself. When you add in the fact that carries and travels are being called less and less, it's clear to see that this is the most imbalanced the game has ever been, and it's making a much worse product for us fans. The NBA regular season is already facing criticisms for being too long and repetitive. And while that may be true, I'm sure these criticisms wouldn't be as loud if the on-court product was in a better place. And what would be the main complaints about this below par product? Reffing, flopping, and complaining. Reffing is terrible because the level of contact it takes to draw a defensive foul is so low that it seems like the officials are guessing whether or not to call a foul on every possession. Trae Young draws a foul here for literally nothing. Flopping is out of control because it has become the easiest way to draw a foul on both sides of the ball. And complaining from players are high because refereeing is so inconsistent that questions need to be asked after every whistle or non-whistle. The most interesting part about the constant complaining though is that the guys that do it the most are the guys that get the most calls, the stars. If I were to make a list of the 7 players who get the best whistle, it would go like this. Number 7, Ja Morant. He carries the ball all over the place. He gets away with a lot of up and downs, a lot of travels. He uses the off arm to fend off defenders sometimes. Watch Porter take an elbow to his face right here. He also goes to the line for the slightest contact made and jumps into players for foul calls. Number 6 would be Lillard. He has mastered the art of running into defenders who are still or moving backwards and flailing for foul calls. He was actually one of the most vocal guys against the reffing changes in 2021, and it's not hard to see why. Number 5 would probably be James Harden. He's only this slow because he's not as aggressive a scorer as he used to be, but the antics are still there, so of course we can't leave him off. He was another that came out against the rule changes in 2021. Number 4 would probably be Giannis. He gets to run over people with a lowered shoulder.
I just don't understand how that's not a charge.
I mean, my goodness.
He gets to use his off arm to create space. He gets to travel. And he gets away with his fair share of carrying violations. He gets to do all of this and lead the league in free throw attempts per game. And yes, Giannis is fouled a lot. But if he was called for all the offensive fouls he committed, he'd probably only play 20 minutes a game. Number 3 would probably be Trae Young, because he's a pure Harden disciple who draws some of the most outrageous fouls you've ever seen. Number 2 would be Luka, who gets away with being physical with his defenders, then goes to the line for the slightest contact made after flopping. He's another guy that gets away with a bunch of obvious carrying violations. And of course, number 1 would be the league MVP, Joel Embiid. And I don't think any explanation is needed. If you watch Embiid play, you know why he's here. These are the guys league referees bow to the most, and most of them complain about foul calls every chance they get. In 2021, the league's competition committee seemed to have had enough and put out some points of emphasis to help the refs get the game back to a fair place. They tried to eliminate a bunch of foul baiting tactics, including pump faking and diving into defenders, hooking, leg kicks, and the refs seemed to stop calling obvious flopping and flailing in general. For 2 months, it was the best the NBA had been in years. Fans seemed to react unanimously in support of these changes, and the product was just much better. So what happened? The stars complained.
Like the way the game is being officiated is unacceptable. I don't want to go too deep into it so they make a big deal out of it, but the explanations that just getting missed, I mean, come on, man, I'm not even a player that I felt like coming in, the rule change wouldn't affect me because I don't do the trick to referees, I don't do the trick plays, and it just is unacceptable, man.
And this as an excuse, but a lot has been made about the rule changes and how they're calling the game. Have you felt
it's still basketball at the end of the day? No matter how much of a big deal we try to make it, a foul is a foul.
And I don't know if it was the referees or higher up, but the league bent. They gave the guys who get all the money, the guys who get to demand trades wherever, whenever. The league continues to give them reffing that leads to a clearly worse product. It makes no sense. What are they gonna do? Quit? Fans wanna see these guys work for their buckets. We wanna see Giannis have to develop a jump hook or a midi. We wanna see Embiid actually use his size to be dominant and not fall to the ground for fouls. Fans want a fair and free-flowing game, and those 2021 rule changes gave us a glimpse into how we can get there. Option 1. They nerf what the offense is allowed to do massively and bring it down to the level of the defense. That would mean taking a lot of physicality out of the game, calling a lot more offensive fouls when offensive players initiate contact and lower their shoulder, taking most of the physicality out of screening, all of the holding, pushing and grabbing, eliminating ball handlers' ability to constantly put their hands under the ball, which should take away carrying, and of course, tightening the traveling calls. Stripping back the game's offense like this would make the game equal for an already stripped back defense, which would take us back to the days where the rules were much more strictly enforced. Option number 2 would be scaling up what defenders are allowed to do. This would likely mean bringing back hand checking, allowing bumps on players coming around screens, and allowing defenders to initiate more contact, while being more physical in general. This would probably mean an even more physical version of 2000s NBA basketball. And the third option would be somewhere in the middle, stripping back offense a little, which would mean cleaning up illegal screening by eliminating holding and sliding, taking away defensive fouls where the offense clearly initiates the contact, eliminating the rip through completely, calling the carries where a player clearly moves the ball upwards, calling the push-offs and the using of the off arm to ward off contests, and stop favoring the offensive players on block charge calls, which would probably mean a lot more no calls in those situations, and a lot more no calls in the game in general. And finally, referees should be much more lenient on landing space fouls. Defenders shouldn't be punished for being there and the offensive player kicking out or falling down. There's no risk for injury there anyway. Out of the three options, this would probably be my favorite. Although the idea of a very physical NBA in today's space and space era is intriguing, I think this middle ground would promote some of the most exciting free-flowing basketball we've ever seen. It would take a lot of control out of the referee's hands, and fans won't feel the need to complain about reffing after every game. Hopefully the NBA soon realizes how serious this reffing issue is, and finally make the changes needed to get us back to a fair game.